Если говорить по-русски о opportunity, значит, у нас в гостях профессор Кембриджского университета, профессор Джон Паркер. Он был редактором журнала «Генетики», он был директором Кембриджского ботанического сада, он счастливо сейчас вышел в отставку и очень этим счастлив, но продолжает работать по истории науки. То есть он был всегда ботаником, он занимался ботаникой и цитогенетикой растений. И сделал действительно замечательные вещи, замечательно работал в этой области. А сейчас он занимается историей науки, и вот сегодня он, значит, прочитает нам лекцию о том, как Дарвин, вообще говоря, пришел к происхождению видов. Ну, этого дальше он вам все расскажет сам. Значит, это все будет, естественно, идти на английском, без всякого перевода. Так что, значит, но он говорит по-английски гораздо лучше, чем я говорю по-русски. Да, это не комплимент. Нет, чем я говорю по-английски. Да, наверное. Да, хорошо. Окей, Джон, I said that your English is much better than my Russian. No, than my English. Okay, you will.
Can we have the curtains closed?
Oh, sorry, I will close.
Do you want me to use?
If you're happier, I will just stand and talk to you rather than use the microphone when I have to be in the same place. I like walking about when I'm giving talks. So, as far as I could gather from the introduction, Professor Borodin said one or two things about me. My background is as a geneticist, mainly studying chromosomes, mainly studying plants, although I worked on birds as well. But I've always, like many of us, been fascinated by evolution and the mechanisms by which evolution takes place are the things which I've devoted my life as a research scientist to. But as you get older, I found anyway, and I think that many people do, what becomes in many ways more interesting than the day-to-day experimental science is trying to think about where the ideas that underpin the science that you're doing come from. Where are the ideas which are fundamental to our discipline arising? Where did Mendel get his inspiration? And in particular for me, where did Darwin get his inspiration? So I've devoted my spare minutes for the last few years to thinking about Darwin. And I was in the right place. The right place happens to be Cambridge, because it's at Cambridge that Darwin was transformed. And this is what I want to talk about today, is a long way to the origin, because what I want to look at is how is it that the ideas which we now take for granted, where did they come from? How is it that Darwin produced these ideas? I often start lectures on genetics by talking about garden peas, about F1 hybrids, about tall and dwarf peas, about segregation, and then ask the audience, who am I talking about? You know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about, somebody say. No, not peas. Mr. Mendel, the Gregor Mendel, the monk of Brno. Well, I'm not. I'm talking about a chap called Thomas Andrew Knight, who was a farmer in the west of England. And he did the work on peas, on segregation, on hybrids, 65 years before Gregor Mendel. Mendel knew that work, and that's why he started work on garden peas. So Mendel does not come in the way that history relates. Suddenly, out of nowhere, he has a history, he has a background. So my thinking about evolution is obviously centering around one great person, and that great person is Charles Darwin. But again, Charles Darwin did not come from nowhere, but it appears as if he did. And there are many reasons why it appears as if Charles Darwin is the start of our knowledge of evolution. One of them is a psychological one. If you went to see Charles Darwin in his house in Kent, in England, when you left, he would give you a picture. And this is the picture that he would present to you. So he would give you a present and you would take it away. And it was his own picture. Now, that's a very imposing picture. I would suggest to you that that looks like a Greek god. One of these statues of the ancients, somebody like Aristotle. He had that picture made for himself. And in fact, when he had it made, he was not as old as he looks in the picture. So in modern day terms, it's an anti-Botox picture. In other words, he made himself look older rather than younger. And the reason was to give himself a sense of his own importance. And this is an image that he created about himself, and it's an image that his son, Francis Darwin, also created for his father, so that he made his father out to be this almost godlike figure. And this is an illustration of him from his house. So he's a great man for the University of Cambridge, Charles Darwin, and a few years ago we had a celebration. Our university was 800 years old, and for that we had a series of great men of the university portrayed. We have Newton, Isaac Newton, for example, as one of our great scientists, and also Charles Darwin. Now this is the image, kind of image that generally people associate with Darwin. An old man. There's a book to do with it somewhere, isn't there? It's called something like On the Origin of Species. It's something to do with tortoises and turds, something like that, and it's on an island. So here you have the popular image of Charles Darwin. If you ask people what else do they know about Charles Darwin, they usually come up with saying, oh, well, there was something to do with a ship and a voyage, and here is the ship, the Beagle. So people know about that, and it's a long voyage he took. And, you know, if you really probe deeply, you might find that they knew it was something to do with the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean. And the other thing that you might get if you probe people, ask people, is you can ask them and say, well, tell me something about what Darwin did. And the answer that you often get is, well, it was something to do with finches, wasn't it? Little birds. This is an illustration of some of the finches collected by Darwin, done by a British naturalist called Gould. But it's a legend. You go to the Galapagos and you see the finches. Here's one of the thick-billed ones. And this is the one that actually uses the cactus spine as a tool. So this is Bird the tool user, a human-type attribute of using tools. In this case, it's only making its nest. I wasn't lucky enough to see it with a cactus spine. But those birds have nothing whatsoever to do with the theory of evolution and the origin of species, as the book. This work was done in the 20th century by a couple called Rosemary and, what was his other name? I'm sorry, the Grants, anyway, a husband and wife couple who worked on these birds. So that's probably about all you're going to get about Charles Darwin from the average person, and possibly many of you don't know much more. But it seems from this kind of idea that this kind of information began with Charles Darwin, and it began in 1859 with the Origin of Species, the publication of the book. But it isn't true, of course, any more than it's true that Mendel was the first to start using garden peas as genetic tools. Darwin was not the first to start using ideas from the natural world about evolution. So what I want to tell you about is the background to Darwin's life, which meant that he was able, in 1859, to write the seminal work, the book which set our modern theory of evolution on its course. In other words, what I want to do is to describe to you how a person like Darwin, like a young man like this, became not a colourless individual, not just an outline of a person, but he became the full-coloured Darwin that we know today. So what is that transition? What are the ideas? Where did the ideas come from? Well, I'm going to tell you right at the beginning, they came from this man, John Stevens Henslow, of whom many of you will never have heard. If you have heard of him, he has given one role in history of biology, and that role is that he wrote a letter to Captain Fitzroy of HMS Beagle recommending Charles Darwin for the voyage as the scientist, well, the gentleman companion, actually his friend, so to speak, his dining companion, on a voyage around the world on HMS Beagle. Henslow wrote the letter. But there's rather more to it than just one letter. Henslow was a remarkable man. Born in eastern England, he went to Cambridge at the age of 18 and graduated in mathematics. So he was, and a very good mathematician as well. He came very near the top of all the mathematicians in his year in the university. People said that if he hadn't spent so much time doing other jobs, other activities, other hobbies, he would have been the top mathematician. But he was really very, very good. He then spent time working what we call a demonstrator, that is working for the professor of chemistry in the university for 3 years. And at that time, the professor of chemistry was actually engaged in the formulating the theories which later were developed by Michael Faraday about electrochemistry. So there was a mathematician working on the borders of chemistry and of physics. As a result of this, and as a result of his own knowledge, when the professor of mineralogy died, Henslow, at the age of 27, was appointed to be the professor of mineralogy, a ridiculously young age. 2 years later, he was elected professor of botany as well. So by the age of 29, this mathematician was a professor of mineralogy and of botany. Quite a remarkable progress and quite a remarkable intellectual career. He went to this college. This is his college in Cambridge. It looked the same then as it does now. Nothing has changed. Cambridge in 800 years doesn't change very fast. But what was he doing while he was there and while he was a young man? He was what we call a polymath. He knew about practically everything. And here we've got a few of the things which he did. He was mapping geology, geological systems, at a time when this was virtually a new science. Field mapping of Britain was undertaken from about 1800 to 1815 for the first time. He was right there, and by 1819 he was mapping a complex system on one of the islands off the coast of Britain. He worked, because of his mathematical interests, he worked on with the structure of crystals. And crystals are very important in the origin of evolution. And if you don't know, well, I'll tell you by the end of today, you will know why crystals are probably the most important things. Inert crystals are most important in biology. He was working at a time when the mollusks, the snails and the slugs, were not known, and he worked on the internal anatomy. And not only that, he took his slugs and snails and he took them and watched them in the field And he started a science which was not begun or not named for another 60 years, and that's the science of ecology, the relationship of the organism and its environment in nature. And finally, he was a marine biologist of note. He collected animals, and if you want to see some of his marine animals, they're still in the Natural History Museum in London and are labelled by Henslow. Not bad for a young man before the age of 25. And the thing that made his name, though, in Cambridge and nationally was this. In 1822, he published a paper. By now he was 26, and he published this paper of an island, another island off the coast of Britain. And it's off the coast of Wales to the west of Britain. And this geology picture that he produced is essentially unchanged today. And he did the mapping for this in 6 weeks. He walked every day about 60 to 70 kilometers, mapping from his base, which was, well, doesn't matter where, but somewhere in the right-hand side. He walked the whole island, and he mapped the whole thing, and it's pretty well precisely exact. And that is an extraordinary piece of field geology. He had a brilliant eye for looking at natural geology in the field. When Darwin later did his first geology on the Beagle voyage, which was on the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas as the Argentinians call them, he used Henslow's paper as his methodology. And he wrote out, we have the manuscript that Darwin wrote in Cambridge, he wrote out sentences from this paper of Henslow's and said, and now I will do the same on the Falklands. And he broke down Henslow's methodology, applied it to his own studies of the Falklands. So Darwin, as geologist, has a direct line of succession from Henslow, the geologist. But he was also doing all sorts of things. As I've said, he also was one of the first to understand the anatomy of mollusks. But at the same time, I haven't mentioned, he also began to study plants. So while he was doing all this chemistry, physics, geology, mineralogy, crystallography, he was also studying plants. And his oldest plant specimen we have was collected when he was an undergraduate student in 1816. However, we had no knowledge of this until recently, and I recently, well, over the last few years, I've analysed the collections of plants that Henslow made. And what you can see here is that suddenly, in 1821, he started collecting wild British plants. And he peaked, you see, in 1826-7, with collecting something nearly 600 plants in the course of a year, while doing all his other jobs. And I should say at the time, while having a wife and 3 children as well. He was immensely active in all sorts of ways. And here is the result. But there's a sudden cut-off. By this time, roughly 1831, he'd done that work, and he didn't do any more. So it's a very discrete period of time over which he worked collecting plants. So the question then is, that accounts for 7,000 individual specimens. Why did he do it? Well, he didn't only have 7,000 specimens, and this is something that we would find very difficult to do today. He gathered together a huge network of scientists and friends, acquaintances, distributed all over Britain. And he managed to get 15,000 specimens, with that 7,000 of his own, 8,000 from other people, distributed over the whole country. And that is a scientific network that any of us in science would be proud to have been able to generate, even with the use of computers and telephones, and as well with modern means of transport. There were not even railways when he was doing this, so it was all done by he himself and his friends. He couldn't travel very far, he didn't have very much money, but he had friends all over the country. So why was he collecting all these huge numbers? Well, at the time, people in botany were very much focused on taxonomy, the classification of plants. Following on from Linnaeus, we had the French school of de Candolle busy classifying plants and turning them into, developing what we now have as the classical way of looking at plant systematics and taxonomy. He wasn't doing that, and he wrote deliberately that he was not doing that. His interest is in what he called physiological botany, and this was of interest owing to the numerous and striking phenomena to explain. Now, physiological botany is a term now that doesn't, it means physiology to us, but to him, physiological botany meant biochemistry, development, as well as physiology, even things that we might think of as genetics and evolution, although those words, of course, were not existing. In other words, botany, what he was doing was something experimental, not something that was just formulaic and taxonomic. What was he doing? Well, we can see what he was doing from what he collected and how he collected it. Here is an example. This is the very first example we have where he collected a plant, in this case a moss, a small moss, and you can see the size of it. That's a centimetre scale on the left-hand side with this row of mosses. And he's dissected them all out and laid them down in this way to show variation, in this case based on increasing size from left to right. An amazing piece of very delicate work. And that's the very first collection that we have of him as a mature individual collecting plants. And it became obsessive. Here is an example where he's collected 7 orchids from a wood, orchidaceae, Orchis fusca he called it, from a wood near his home in Kent. And what he's done is he's laid them out in this way, large one on the left, middle-sized ones in the middle, small ones there on the right. Now I've put them together in that order, but those are the things he collected. And he collected them on the same day in the same place. In other words, he went into the wood and he found the biggest one he could find and the smallest ones he could find, and he got an idea of the pattern of variation. He then put these things together and he made patterns on paper of these small plants. And here is a grass in which he's taken the largest on the left down to the smallest. And he used a special word for this in English called collation. A collation is when you take, say, several poems or something and you can bring them together and you can have some common theme. Well, what is the common theme of collation for Henslow? Well, here he was combining plants he received from different places, and what he was trying to do was to establish what he thought was the most fundamental problem in biology. And the problem in biology was the nature of species. In other words, he was trying to find an experimental way of examining species. And here is one of the collations that he did. He here went to this place near Cambridge, and he went with his students and collected, and you can see clearly what he's done. He's collected these plants of different sizes, he's laid them out, he's got a complete spectrum of the pattern of variation present. Now the importance for our story is, of course, who were amongst his students. Well, there were many of them, one of whom, though, was Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin was there on the very day that these plants were collected. He took field trips, just as we do today, took students out into the field, and amongst the students, the one who never missed a field course in his entire 3 years in Cambridge was Charles Darwin. As an aside, this kind of idea of variation, you can still see it in living plants as well as dried plants. This is the Botanic Garden in the University of Cambridge, and here you have a particular species, a pine tree, right in the heart of the garden, in the most important part, and you can see the difference between the two trees. On the left, a huge spreading tree which comes from the Mediterranean. On the right, a narrow, slender tree which comes from near Vienna in Austria. And he's grown them together. So that really is the same in living trees as he was displaying in his paper, his papers, his herbarium sheets of dead plants. Now he was a mathematician, Henslow, and he was one of the first of the mathematical biologists, at least in Britain. And one of the things that he did was take this plant, which is called Paris quadrifolia, which means 4 leaves, and he went and found this. He found that if you went to a population of these plants, you went into a wood near Cambridge, and you found these plants, what you found was, what you could see was some of them had 4 leaves, some of them didn't. They had 5, like the one up there. Even that one up there with 6. And those are numbers of leaves. He also counted the number of sepals, the number of petals, the number of stigmas that there are on these plants, and he put them all together. This, as far as I'm aware, is the first ever time anybody has made a population study of anything, ever. And he went out and he collected 1,500 plants of this one species. He counted all those different parts of the plant, 5 different parts of the plant, that's the columns across, and he came out with 38 different variants amongst those, and he catalogued them all. And then he goes on in the paper to discuss the significance of this pattern of variation, and he relates it to when you look at other species of Paris from different parts of the world, which have different numbers of floral parts. So he was getting towards the idea of developmental variation underlying new species. Quite an extraordinary thing. And as I say, if anybody knows better, I would like to know, because as far as I'm aware, that is the first ever study of variation in nature. And 1,500 individuals is an awful lot. There are 7,500 bits of data, as we would now say, in that. He also was interested in the fact that changes in populations not only affected sizes of things, but also affected massive changes in development. Here we have, if you look at this fern, the second from the left, this one, the top is divided into 3 parts. And those 3 parts are unusual, and it's what he called a monstrosity. So did Darwin. And these developmental monstrosities were difficult to explain. They're still difficult to explain, even in this day of molecular biology and development. But here we have it. So they were fascinating because they showed something very striking, and he tried to explain that. But the third thing, and for something which becomes a problem for Darwin later, is that Henslow was also sure that he could demonstrate heredity and the mechanisms of heredity. Now we're talking now of 30 or 40 years before Mendel, and he wrote this paper about species. And what he did was said you could take 2 species in a hybrid, compare them in all their parts, and then from the comparison, he said if you could accumulate 100 of these different hybrids involving different species, you would understand the nature of heredity. Well, you can't. You have to do it as a physicist would do an experiment, which is what Mendel did. But nevertheless, this is what he thought was the way to tackle heredity. He was right in some ways because he was interested in hybrids, and hybrids are the key, however you define them. So here we are of his botanical program from 1821 to 35. He was interested in species limits. How do you define species? How do you understand development through monstrosities? And finally, how do you use hybridization to tell you about species concepts? Because what he said was quite remarkably modern. He said that if things were different species, then they would either not hybridize with each other, or if they hybridized, they would be sterile. So he got completely the 20th century concept of the biological species concept straight away as his test of whether his ideas about species were correct. So let's now turn a little to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin went to become a medical student at Edinburgh University. He was unable to complete his studies because he hated blood. And throughout his life, Darwin was paranoid about blood. If his children, for example, fell over outside and cut themselves, he could do nothing about it. He was a loving father, but he just ran to his wife and got her to attend to the children. Blood terrified him. And the terrifying aspect of blood came about when he was a medical student, because he couldn't stand the thought of operations, of cutting people's arms or legs off without anaesthetic. And not many of us could. But for Darwin, it became paranoia throughout his life. So, if you can't go into to become a medical man, a doctor, like his father was, and his elder brother, what was he going to do? Well, there was nothing else for him to do, really, at that time, except go into the Church of England and become a vicar, look after a church in England. And so he was sent to Cambridge to train to become a vicar. So here we have Darwin, who's often equated with the anti-clerical, starts his career at Cambridge training in theology. But while he was in Cambridge, his only real interest were these things: beetles. He did nothing on theology as far as we can tell. He never went to a single lecture, but he collected beetles. So much so that people started drawing pictures of him. And here is Charles Darwin on riding his beetle, and because he was obsessive about beetles. Being an obsessive brought him in contact with John Henslow. And on that complicated slide, I've just put in areas of Cambridge where he came into contact with John Henslow. And the important thing is here, he came to do theology. He did none. What did he do? He attended Henslow's botany course. Not only once, but 3 times. This is the same course. Henslow gave a single course in May and June of each year, and Darwin went to it 1829, 1830, and 1831. He became known in Cambridge as the man who walks with Henslow. He became the person that Henslow, whenever you saw Henslow, you saw a young man by his side, and the young man was Charles Darwin. So here we have the influence of Henslow. When Charles Darwin first saw Henslow, he was with the man that drew that picture of him riding a beetle. And he asked this chap, "Who is that man over there?" And the response was, "Oh, that's Professor Henslow. He's the man that knows everything." And throughout his life, Darwin kept manuscript books, big books like this, which were headed "Questions for Henslow." Whenever he didn't know anything, he used to write this question down in his book and then send a letter to Henslow and say, "Please, can you tell me about X and Y?" He was the mentor that we all need throughout our lives, somebody to turn to who tells you, as it tells you, the truth about whatever it is you want to know. And for Darwin, Henslow was that man. Now, Henslow recognized something in Darwin that was very important, I think. And the very important thing he recognized was that Darwin was a brilliant field worker. And in particular, he was a brilliant geologist. And if you had to rank Darwin, you'd find that I think my argument would be that he is first and foremost a geologist, a superb geologist. There have not been many field workers better than Darwin. Secondly, he was a zoologist, and third, he was a botanist. Well, Henslow realized this. He was a geologist of well-known standing. So what he did was to teach him basically that he had to send Darwin to different parts of Britain to do proper geology. That is what we call hard rock geology, the geology of complex systems of volcanic and sedimentary rocks. And he sent him with Henslow's friend was this man, Adam Sedgwick, and Sedgwick was at that time studying the volcanic systems of North Wales. This is a map. He was working here. These are the highest mountains in Wales, around here, and that's where he was working. Well, Sedgwick took Darwin on a trip in 1831, and what happened was that they came across from Cambridge, and they got to a place here, which you can just see, Denby, there, and the teaching of Henslow was exemplary. Of Sedgwick, it was a bit difficult. What happened was, in Denby, Sedgwick opened the coach door, said to Darwin, get out, walk from there, here, to another place, which is here, Bangor it's called, on a straight line compass bearing, and tell me if you find any old red sandstone. That was the teaching. So Darwin dutifully, as a young man, very active, energetic, he walked that whole distance, which is about 120 kilometers, just himself. And he walked in a straight line on a compass bearing and got to Bangor, where he met Sedgwick and said, there is no old red sandstone. And that's quite true. Darwin was quite right. There wasn't any. Anyway, that was his training in geology. There was a bit more to it, but that was basically it. Now, when he got back from this, on the way back, though, the oldest Darwin specimen we have of any sort, animal, plant, rock, is this one. And I had the honour of discovering this in the herbarium in Cambridge. And it was collected in North Wales, August 1831, C. Darwin. That's Charles Darwin collecting a plant that his mentor, Henslow, needed for his collection. And Henslow did not have it. It's a rare, rare plant in Britain. And Henslow sent Darwin, said, go and get this plant. So that's the oldest specimen we have. And he collected it while on this geology trip. Well, when he came back from the trip, Darwin got a letter, and the letter was the one which indicated, from John Henslow, indicating that he was about to be offered the opportunity to take the trip around the world on HMS Beagle. So this summer of 1831 was very important for Charles Darwin. So here we are, that's what happened. A young man then, Darwin, he was born in 1809, so he was only 22 at this time. He set off from England and of course got back in 1836, 5 years later. And he spent most of the time in South America, where the HMS Beagle was surveying the rocks and the sea, because it's a very dangerous coast, and the knowledge of it was needed for trade, for ships going around the south of South America. So here is what we know of Darwin. He sets off on the recommendation of John Henslow. But just to put it in perspective, when Darwin set off, Henslow actually essentially was writing this kind of thing. It was the variation of species, the nature of species, that intrigued Henslow. So it's not surprising this young man was sent off on a voyage with this idea of species firmly in his mind. So species and the species concept is not an invention of Darwin. It's an invention of his boss, John Henslow. And Darwin understood about variation and about species. He also, Darwin, understood about populations. And this is the kind of thing he did when he was away. Here he is in Chile, collecting a particular plant, which shows, not very clearly perhaps for you, but it shows enormous variation, and it shows Darwin collecting populations of individuals. So not only was Henslow doing it, but so was Darwin. So if anything, Darwin was probably the second person in the world ever to make serious population studies. And here you can see very, very clearly the collections. Here Darwin has arrived in Patagonia in South America in 1832. October 1832. He'd only been gone now for about 9 months. He'd been through Brazil, they'd been down through Argentina and Uruguay, and now he was in southern Argentina in Patagonia. He gets off the boat at Bahia, Bahia Blanca, and goes ashore and collects. Well, he collects this rather dull grass, rather boring looking thing. But look what he did. He didn't just collect the grass, he collected them from the smallest he could find up in the top left to the biggest he could find in the center there. So he was making a population sample exactly as Henslow had done and Henslow had shown him done. So that's essentially the same as he did on the field courses with his mentor Henslow. And here, you know, this was one of the puzzling things which becomes critical in evaluating the theory of evolution by natural selection. Here you've got a genus that he knew well. It grows here, 2 viola, and he found this new species, which we now call Magellanica for Magellan from South America. 2 large ones, 2 small ones. So not only did he just collect the new species, but he collected for variation at the same time. Also, very importantly, he was interested, or Henslow was very interested in this problem, which was, what happens if you grow plants from one place in another place? Do they change or do they stay the same? Here you are. Differences in response to change of location. Do they change? So when Darwin got to Valparaiso in Chile, what he did, he collected a European species. This is common in Western Europe, common in Britain. Darwin knew it. We know he'd seen it before he left. Anyway, he found it growing as a weed in the streets of Valparaiso, just everywhere in the streets. And he collected it for showing variation. Little one on the bottom left, very big one, different leaf shapes and everything. And so what he was trying to do was answer a question to do with biogeography, to do with climate, to do with plasticity, to do with genetics, all of those things wrapped up in really what we would think of as an evolutionary question. Darwin was also a model student. He's model in the sense that he did what his master told him to do. And here is one example. Henslow, when he used to collect things like these ferns, would fold them over so you could see both sides, the upper side and the lower side of a leaf of a fern. Well, when the first plants came back from South America collected by Darwin, he sent everything from the trip back to Henslow. Henslow got these plants and found they were not very well done. His student was not behaving very well. So he sent a letter, and he sent the letter which shows a fern being folded over in the middle. And he said, for goodness sake, if you get this sort of thing, this is what you have to do. Pull yourself together. He didn't say that, he was too polite. But that's what he was saying. Do things better. And the amazing thing for us to contemplate is the fact that he wrote it, as you see, to Charles Darwin, HMS Beagle, somewhere in the South Atlantic, which is a big area of sea. And Darwin got the letter. So it says something for the postal system of the time, that they delivered it. But here he got that. Well, what did Darwin do? He said, yes, sir. So what he did was when he got a fern, he folded over the pinny just in the way that the letter told him to do. So here he is in the Galapagos doing that. But not only that, he wasn't closed-minded. He also was thinking along monstrosities. Now that previous one showed a normal fern, as you probably know it. Well, here is a mutant, or as we would say, a monstrous form of this same fern collected by Darwin. So Darwin was not only familiar with all those things that I've talked about, but also with monstrosity. And monstrosity plays quite a role in the origin of species, as we see. Well, of course, the Galapagos is very important. This is the kind of view that Darwin was experiencing in the Galapagos, this wonderful volcanic system of islands with remarkable organisms. I'm sorry, that shouldn't have gone that way. What's happening now? Sorry, I'm going backwards. Right. And one of the first things, of course, he found were these things, the marine iguanas. Horrible. He didn't like them at all, even though he was a zoologist and biologist. And they are, I think, they were so evil, he called them the imps of darkness. And they just lie around. When they're not swimming in the sea, they are lying around by your feet. But one of the things he noticed, of course, having been trained in this is on one island. This is actually on Fernandina Island. This one is on Hispaniola. And you can see the difference, variation, in this case in the colors of these marine iguanas. So immediately he was seeing color differences associated with different islands. And he was finding plants that he'd never seen before. He was thoroughly acquainted with cacti because cacti are all over South America. That's where they originated in evolutionary terms, and he knew all about them. He got to the Galapagos, and on the volcanic islands, the first colonizers is a cactus which is endemic to Isabella and Fernandina, two of the western islands, nowhere else on Earth. So suddenly he's coming across these volcanic rocks with new species that he'd never seen before. And he'd spent 3 years in South America with cacti. But the most important thing, I think, was this plant called Scalesia. It's what we in England would call a daisy flower. And he found different forms. There's one, and there's another. You can see the difference between them, probably. It's quite easy to spot. But the amazing thing for Darwin was suddenly he was familiar with all these plants. He'd never seen this type of plant. He'd never seen this in South America. But what he suddenly was presented with was a completely new group, 5 species of this, including these things, daisies that were growing as trees. And here they are. This is on Santa Maria, a forest. And just to show you how big they are, that's a Volkswagen van. And these things are not the daisies that you get in your lawn, but they're monstrous trees, growing up to anything up to about 30 meters tall, with real trunks. So suddenly there you had this species, group of species, on the Galapagos and nowhere else, as far as Darwin knew, on Earth. And they were forming these extraordinary forests. But the thing that really set him going, and he writes in his diary about it, was this thing. He calls it a thecla, and the thecla was the name he used for a mockingbird that was found in Chile. Anyway, he found these things, and he found that they were different. This comes from Hood Island, what he called Hood Island, and this one comes from what we call Santa Maria. They're both Theclas. They're both members of this genus Neomimus now, Nesomimus. But what he wrote in his diary when he visited the Galapagos was he wondered if these things were merely varieties, or would an ornithologist regard them as different species. So straight away he's beginning on the Galapagos to think about the difference between variation as varieties of one species, or variation giving rise, if you like, to new species. And it's the first indication we have is associated with these particular birds. But you can see now from things like the Scalesia, the daisy trees, how he was being influenced all the time by the variation and by the novelty of the Galapagos. Now let's come back to Cambridge. When he was only young, 25 years old, not only did Henslow become secretary of a philosophical society, that was a society to do with science in Cambridge, the first one ever in Cambridge, and the first one in Britain after the Royal Society. He was secretary from 21 to 39. He was one of the first scientists that made Cambridge the science university that it is today. Well, what he did was this. Darwin wrote back letters to everybody, to his family, to his friends, but in particular he wrote a whole series of letters to John Henslow. The first 7 of those letters, when they had been received by Henslow, Henslow realized they were really important letters, and they were important about the geology of South America. So what Henslow did was to take the letters and to read them to the scientists of Cambridge. And he read them, and they discussed them. He and Professor Sedgwick, the geologist, discussed with him, and they were quite extraordinary. Now, when Darwin heard from his sister that Professor Henslow had read his letters, he was really upset, because he knew what he'd written in those letters. And there were all sorts of personal things about the sailors and their activities on board ship. All sorts of unsuitable things are recorded in the letters. They're really quite fun to read because they've got all this human detail. Well, Henslow was not stupid, and he edited the letters, and all you got was the science of geology and nothing else. He then printed them all and presented them to people as an edition of studies of the geology of South America. So what was the impact of this? When Darwin left Cambridge, he was 22 years old. He was known by no one except John Henslow. He had no scientific standing at all. He went round the world, and he got back. Suddenly, he was a celebrated person. He was a traveller. He explored parts of the world people had not any knowledge of at all, and he was a brilliant geologist, as shown simply by the letters that Henslow had presented to the great scientists of Cambridge. So at a stroke, Darwin became a great scientist. The impact of all that I've been telling you can be seen in The Origin of Species, this little book that changed the world. And here it is. If you look at the chapters of The Origin, those that I've outlined there, which there are 8 of them, are all concerned with the research carried out by John Henslow in the 1820s, 30 years earlier. Research that was carried out before Darwin ever reached Cambridge, and carried out delivered to Darwin as a great package of information by John Henslow. So John Henslow goes down in history as a letter writer, but he was actually a scientific mentor. He created this person, John Henslow. Well, what did Darwin think of Henslow? Well, Darwin wrote about him when Henslow died, only 2 years, you see, after The Origin was published in 80. It was published in 59. He died in 61. He could do minute observations, so he was an analyst, a great analyst. He was a brilliant illustrator as well of his work, which helped greatly. But not only that, but he could do big synthetic things. And Darwin quotes there the Anglesey geology paper, which was the one that Darwin himself had used for his first studies of geology. So Darwin had an immense regard, of course, for his teacher. And it's been noted by many others, and in particular, I'm very pleased with Robert Gunter's contribution, a founder of the History of Science Museum in Oxford. He said, without Henslow, there would have been no Darwin. You would never have heard of Darwin if it hadn't been for Henslow. He would have been a vicar in charge of a church in a tiny village in the depths of England, collecting beetles. So unless you'd been obsessed with beetles like Darwin, you would never have heard of him. What Henslow did, here he is as an old man, what he did was to spot genius. And he took the genius of Charles Darwin and made a scientist of him. So that is the story behind The Origin of Species. It's a long journey. It's 30 years in the gestation. But the origin of that was through John Henslow and his research. But finally, I should say, is why was Henslow so obsessed with variation? And the reason is from crystallography. Until 1805, studies of crystals were random and haphazard. Every time a new crystal was found, it was simply described in terms of the angles of the plates that are taken up by the crystalline form. Then along came a Frenchman called the Abbé Hauy. And the Abbé Hauy is actually important in French science because he was Napoleon's advisor on science. So a very important person. But what Hauy did was something very simple, as we would see it, but very mind-breaking at the time. He applied mathematics to crystals, and he established the mathematical principles which underlie crystal structure. And that means that you can take a vast array of crystals. Suddenly what you find is crystals break down into a small number of groups, of families, of related types. He put order on chaos. What Henslow was doing, trying to understand species, was to put order on chaos. And he did it like Howard. He looked for patterns of variation. So in fact, The Origin of Species is based on the structure of crystals. Because it was Henslow's development in the biological sphere of the crystal structure that Darwin then received as the wisdom of his teacher in 1829 to 1831. And that was the story that he took away with him on the voyage of the Beagle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, questions? Hello.
Dr. Parker, your excellent lecture was devoted first from the variation in nature.
Yes.
But the original species, like Charles Darwin, is started from the variation under domestication.
Yes.
Why so?
Because obviously what Darwin did was 30 years later than what we're talking about now. The idea of variation, though, for
Darwin, then he had enormous interests in domestication, because what he saw was that humans had influenced the patterns of variation to produce variance, apparently. Variance in pigeons, variance in dogs, in horses, and many other things. In fact, he kept pigeons himself and bred them. And if you look at his letters, he was in communication with the practical men of science. And the practical men of science that he saw were the breeders of these organisms. So he thought that the most obvious example, which most people would know, was variation under domestication.
So you mean that was sort of, how to say, to make the book understandable?
Yes, you start with where most people would connect.
Right.
Because most people knew that a Dachshund and a Great Dane and an Alsatian or whatever were different, were all dogs, but different dogs. So he was able to use that as the framework. Then he moves on in the later chapters to explain to people that what you see under domestication is what you actually see in nature. But it's much more difficult for most people to look out there and see variation in nature. And he was writing for a general audience of educated people, not for biologists in 1859. He was writing for the average educated, intellectually educated man and woman in Britain. And so they would know about that domestication, but they would then need to be led gently into thinking about nature, because they didn't really know that side of the story. So it's a question of which do you put first to make the book readable and understandable. Sorry? To sell the idea, as we now would. You put the good stuff up front, which is clear and demonstrable.
Questions?
No questions. Far too. Okay.
Well, that's you told me that about showing that plant, about Fibonacci. That story with mollusks.
Yes.
Did he cancel use some mathematic? I mean, that's the most obvious.
What do you mean, dextral and sinistral twisting of mollusk shells?
Did he apply mathematics to the shells? The question.
I'm trying to think of any. I've never come across that, because of what I haven't discovered. I haven't found Henslow's original collections of mollusks. They're supposed to be in the Zoology Museum in Cambridge, but the Zoology Museum can't find them either. So I don't know. Maybe if I find them, but I have no evidence of him writing about differences in handedness.
Also, I just don't know what happened. What was the standard at that time, for example, in mathematical statistics? Do they know about the distribution?
Right. If you looked at the pictures I showed you, you would think that they were distributions.
Like bell curve.
Bell curves, usually, but not only. Sometimes they were exponential type pictures. No, the answer was that he was obviously groping towards an understanding of statistics, but no formal statistics had been done.
No, it just didn't exist at that time.
There was no science of understanding.
Quetelet.
Well, Quetelet, Frenchman, who wrote in the late 1830s. He was writing this 10, 15 years before that. But it's quite clear that he was arranging them as we would think of them, as normal distributions. But the normal distribution didn't exist. But he was making a visual interpretation of it.
Right. Well, that's about the teacher and the pupil and disciple. I don't see much of mathematics and much of statistics in original picture.
No.
Just what I remember, this amazing story about the multiplication of the elephants.
Yes.
That was the top of mathematics of Charles Darwin.
Yes.
Or what do you say about this?
Well, what I would say is that in his later years, Charles Darwin said, "I wish when I had been a young man I'd paid more attention to algebra." In other words, he was a bloody awful student, Darwin. He was a really bad student, and he was not a mathematician. Henslow was par excellence a mathematician, and I think the way he approached biology was from the sound basis of mathematics, which is extraordinary because mathematical biology was not invented for many years later. But Darwin didn't have the same mathematical way. I think what Henslow spotted in Darwin was a brilliant way of looking at the world and summing up from observation. And if you look at where we got the plants from, I showed the plants from Bahia Blanca. If you read the diary, the journal at that point, what he did was he was making geological observations. He went out one day, came back and wrote his observations, and he made some comments. I wonder if this means this, this, and this about the strata of the rocks. The next day he went out and he tested his hypotheses, and he came back and he wrote about it and said yes or no to the different ideas. But he was able to just look at a landscape and sum it up and ask sensible questions about it. And that is amazing. But that was the skill he had. As a mathematician, he was useless, I'm afraid.
John, what eventually happened to Henslow?
What happened to Henslow is the question. Henslow stayed with Darwin, in communication with Darwin right through his life, and actually was the man in the chair of the great debate when evolution was considered in Oxford in 1858. Henslow was the chairman, and Darwin was represented by Thomas Henry Huxley, and the church by a man called Bishop Wilberforce. Darwin and Henslow was in the centre. At this point, though, Henslow was no longer a research scientist. He himself became what we call the rector, in charge of a church in a small village in the depths of one of England's rural counties, an agricultural county. And he died there in 1861, having been ill really for about 8 or 10 years. But right to the end, Darwin was in communication. One of the sad things, though, as I said, Darwin was paranoid about blood. He didn't like blood at all. He didn't like illness either, even though he was ill for a lot of his life. He was told that Henslow was ill and dying, and he wouldn't come to see him because he would have been too upset himself to see him in that condition. And that really is very sad. In fact, Sedgwick, the geologist, was with him when he died, but Darwin didn't come. And I think Darwin regretted that ever afterwards, that he didn't see his teacher at the end.
Yes, it was really strange attitude. He didn't go to the funeral of his daughter?
No, of his own daughter, his favourite daughter.
Yeah.
He wouldn't go to the funeral. It was too upsetting for him. He had a very strange psychology, I think.
Any more questions? Okay, John, thank you very much. Ну что, спасибо. Да, все, спасибо. Это началось.